Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, and on today's episode, 5 bands with dangerous, confusing, landmine-filled catalogs. And what I mean by that is that they've got big catalogs, they're kind of confusing, and if you pick the wrong album as your first album from them, it could be really dangerous. I made a video about bad first impressions of bands. I'll try to remember to link that down below. And it's sort of the same concept there, but I picked specific albums where they're just bad albums to get into a band from. So these are artists where their catalogs are really big. You have to be really careful what your first record is from them or where you come in with these bands. Pete and Martin did a video on Sea of Tranquility. I think they called it Messy Catalogs. I didn't watch it because I didn't want it to influence me. Not sure the angle they took out on it. But this is what I'm going for here. Messy, big, confusing catalogs with specifically with landmines in them. All right. Genesis. They've got the Peter Gabriel era. The early Peter Gabriel era is different than the later Peter Gabriel or the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway selling England by the pound era. Then you've got then there were 3, Phil Collins on lead vocals, where they're still kind of progressive, but it's a little slimmed down. The sound gets a little tighter. Then you've got sort of the MTV era. Then you got the later MTV era. It is just very confusing. And if you come in at the wrong time with this band, like I did with the MTV stuff, I just ignored them forever. And even though I'm not a fan really of the Peter Gabriel stuff, and I've talked about that on my channel, tried to get into it, it's still so different. I regret that I only thought Genesis was the 80s MTV stuff for the longest time. So there's my first pick. I've got 5 picks here and a bonus at the end. I don't know if I mentioned it. They're in no particular order except for my number 1 pick. Okay, Jethro Tull. They've been around forever, since the late 60s. Still releasing records. The first album especially is a blues record. The early stuff is very bluesy. Then they get progressive concept albums, Thick as a Brick, Passion Play. They get away from that a little bit. They get folksy with stuff like Songs from the Wood. The 80s stuff starts getting synthy, electronic drums. The 2000s, 90s stuff, it's just confusing. And if you come in at the wrong time, like if you came in on one of those 80s records, you'd have no idea that Jethro Tull was a hard rock 70s type of band. If you're somebody who's bought the first record, you think, man, this is just like a straight up 60s, late 60s blues band. What's the big deal about this? So they have a dangerous catalog. I always caution people that don't know anything about Jethro Tull. Like, if you're not somebody who's just a classic rock person, you probably don't want to grab Passion Play as your first Jethro Tull record because it's basically one song. You also probably don't want to grab the first one or any of the 80s stuff because of the electronic elements. So kind of a dangerous catalog with some landmines. Okay, another confusing, dangerous catalog. Sweet, The Sweet. I don't know, what is it? Again, there you go, confusing. Their early stuff where they had the outside writers, Chin and Chapman, I believe they were called, where they were like a bubblegum group, Little Willie. If you were to buy one of those, you'd have no idea that they had this sort of heavy, harder 70s glam phase like Desolation Boulevard. Then they got more sort of AOR hard rock. Then the later, it's just very confusing. Their catalog it's not on Spotify and the streaming services. They just have a very messy catalog, and if you come in at the wrong time, buy the wrong album, it could turn you off from them. All right, another band. You got to be really careful the first album you buy from Deep Purple. The first 3 records are psych, hard rock, like Vanilla Fudge, twisting cover songs around. You could buy the John Lord Deep Purple Orchestra thing and think, what is this? What are these guys? Are they an orchestra? Is this the Moody Blues? What is this? The Mach 2 era. But even then you could get Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale and think, wait a minute, is this the guys that sang Smoke on the Water? Blackmore's out, Tommy Bolin's in, Blackmore's back, Joe Lynn Turner comes in. That would be very confusing if all you know Smoke on the Water and then you grab the Joe Lynn Turner album with them. Steve Morris is in the band. They're just a band with a sprawling catalog, and if you grab them at the wrong time, you could potentially grab the wrong record here and not realize how great they are. All right, this had to be number 1 without question. This guy's catalog is filled with landmines. It's extremely confusing. It's extremely massive. Maybe you can guess Frank Zappa. How many studio albums does he have? I don't know, 60, 70. It's absolutely mind-boggling. He has a mind-boggling number of live records, box sets. It's so all over the place. I always tell people to proceed with caution who know nothing about Zappa, who want to get into him. I'll tell you a funny story. I was in a record store, and this kid comes up to me. He thought I worked in the store for some reason. He said, "Hey, man, do you know where Frank Zappa is?" And this store is kind of strange because they have a classic rock section. So the kid was just looking in the regular section, CD section. And I was like, yeah, well, I don't work here, but I know that it's over there. And he's like, oh, I'm a college kid, a music major, and I just heard a Frank Zappa song, and I want to get into Zappa. Can you tell me where I should start? And I immediately, like this light went off, and it was like I went into this doctoral dissertation to this kid because his catalog is dangerous. You could pick one of his orchestral records. And I mean, I love these things, but they're all over the place. And you could think, is this the guy that did Don't Eat the Yellow Snow? You could pick some of his jazz fusion stuff like Chunga's Revenge, Waka Jawaka. You could pick the more Dr. Dementos type stuff like Don't Eat the Yellow Snow. You've got Cruising with Ruben and the Jets, which is an all doo-wop record. You've got his electronic avant-garde stuff, Civilization Phase 3 and Jazz from Hell. I mean, it is just all over the map, and you could really step into the wrong. His Broadway weird conceptual thing, Thingfish. There's just so many different things going on. You have to be really, really careful when you dive into Frank Zappa. And I'm going to do a video at some point, like, understanding Zappa's catalog, because I'm a huge Zappa fan, haven't done many videos on Zappa, and I'm going to do kind of like getting into Zappa 101 type video. All right, this next one is a bonus, and I'm putting it as a bonus because you kind of can't go wrong with any of their records, but their catalog is just really confusing, and that's the Beatles. And it's confusing because the UK and US versions are so different. Now, the early stuff, I will say the Landmines in their catalogs are those very early records where they're doing mostly covers. But once they got rolling there, you kind of can't go wrong. But I originally had those Red and Blue albums, those compilation records. And I remember being completely confused, like, what studio albums are these on? Trying to find the studio albums that all these things were on. This album, for instance, Hey Jude, for the longest time, I thought this was a studio album. It's not. It's a collection of singles. That's the other problem. The Beatles released a lot of singles that would get thrown on maybe a UK record. Maybe they were just on a US version. Maybe they were put on a compilation. I mean, it's just really confusing. And if you're trying to navigate your way around their catalog, it can be really confusing. And if you're like, hey, I really like this particular song, and you're wondering, like, why isn't this on any of the studio records? Well, again, it's because they had all these singles, and the way they went about things, it was just confusing back then. Could have put the Rolling Stones for the same reason, but the Stones, it was really just like their 60s stuff. By the time they get to the 70s, it sort of straightens itself out, and then the rest of their catalog is okay. Early AC/DC, a little bit like that with the Australian versions, is a little bit confusing, but I don't think you can go wrong with grabbing any AC/DC record. So, all right, there you go. There's my pick for bands, catalogs that are kind of confusing, that are filled with landmines. You can come in at the wrong time. Let me know what you think of my picks. What are your picks? Leave them down below. Hit like and subscribe till we see you again. Make sure you rock hard, ride free.